Chapter 1. He had reached that age where he knew more than a few suicides. Friends, loved ones, relatives, and enemies who'd contemplated the one truly serious philosophical problem and concluded that life in this entropic city was simply not worth the trouble. The protagonist walked down the streets at a brisk pace, though with no particular destination in mind. It was raining, or, more accurately, it had been raining up until a few minutes ago, and the sidewalk was stained, dark, and slick with water. Small droplets on his glasses turned the streetlights into astigmatic pinwheels in his eyes. The protagonist loitered at the deserted street corner, more out of social obligation than safety, and waited for the traffic light to change. Above him, the light was performing without an audience. He stood still for longer than he needed to, as the light went from green to red to green to red again. Not a single car bore witness to this series of events. He wondered if, were he not there himself, would the light continue its purposeless task deep into the evening? More broadly, if all humanity keeled over dead tonight from some plague or Armageddon, how long would this light continue to carry out its assigned duty, maintaining safety on a cold, dead world? Red to green to red to green. He made a mental note to come back someday when he wasn't here to see how the light reacted to his absence. Bored with this thought, the protagonist continued on his journey. It was only a few blocks later that he remembered he forgot to look whether the light was green or red at the specific moment he stepped into the street, and if he was thus now a scofflaw. He continued under an overpass beneath the highway. The cars on the road above rattled their steel beams violently as they sped to their mysterious destinations. A stream of water from a broken gutter splattered on the pavement below. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of a lonely instrument playing a single, constant note that droned on ceaselessly. The next block contained what appeared in the dim light to be a small, dark cemetery, although perhaps it was just an apartment complex, above which telephone poles and wires crisscrossed in a far more complex pattern than one would think would have been necessary. Above the sidewalk, a streetlight sputtered and dimmed randomly, giving the shadows in the graveyard the illusion of movement. The block after that was mostly small, single-family houses, dark and dead at this late hour, but lights and music emanated from what appeared to be a squat and flat-roofed local bar that stood at an intersection of two nameless streets. The protagonist had never noticed this particular establishment, but he would be the first to admit that he was not the most observant person, and so it might well have been there all along. No one had cared to make the bar's nondescript brick exterior inviting to prospective patrons. The only indications that it was a public house at all were a single blinking neon sign that shone through a small window to advertise a brand of beer, and the muffled sounds of multiple conversations emanating from within, partially obscured by music. He stood outside for a few minutes, debating with himself silently. In the alleyway next to the squat and flat-roofed bar, he noticed a faint rummaging sound coming from inside a large trash bin. It was either a raccoon or an heirloom, but the slight blue glow emanating from under the lid implied the latter. The alley smelt of old milk. Some hooligan had scrawled graffiti in dripping black paint on the wall of the building. It said quixotically, "Do you know where you are?" A drink would be nice, to calm his thoughts, but he worried about having to justify his intrusion to the regulars inside. He didn't want to actually talk to anyone. He simply wanted to be near people who were talking, to listen in, to feel included, to feel connected to something outside his own thoughts. But only in theory. Trying to make an actual connection with someone seemed too much work for this late in the evening, and was well outside his current abilities and desires. But he went in anyway, not wanting to loiter in the street and arouse suspicion. It might start raining again any minute. The inside of the bar like most bars of the city, was dark, lamps dimmed to a dull brown glow that was further obscured by a hardened crust of dust baked onto their shades of colored glass. On the walls, neon lights brightly advertised different brands of liquor, interspersed with an odd collection of flotsams that bore no discernible theme other than some unspecified sentimentality to the owner. The protagonist half-heartedly looked around for anyone he knew, but no one seemed particularly familiar, at least not individually. In the aggregate, they at least seemed similar to people he was familiar with, and that was comfort enough for an evening like this. There was no one to greet him when he entered, but he lingered by the door for a few seconds anyway, as his eyes adjusted to the smoke. In the back, a few regulars hovered intently over a game of pool. The majority of tables and booths sat unoccupied, though several hosted groups of people in twos and threes, sometimes chatting, sometimes not. A number of the unoccupied tables still had empty glasses on them, droplets of water from condensation slowly dripping onto the soiled paper napkins beneath. A television hung near the ceiling, broadcasting a movie, soundless and unintelligible. He removed his coat and hat and shook off the remnants of the rain. He smoothed the hair in his forehead with the back of his hand and sat down on a black vinyl stool near the end of the bar. A piece of duct tape inelegantly repaired a large tear in the seat cushion. There was a bartender present, but all the way at the other end, half obscured by steam pouring upwards from a dishwasher. The protagonist waited patiently. Behind the bar was a mirror. He saw himself. Is that really what I look like? He thought. His reflection appeared old, older than he expected. The lighting was poor in here, though, so perhaps his haggard visage was just a trick of the shadows. It was only in the mirror that he observed the two women sitting nearby on the stools beside him. He hadn't noticed them when he sat down, and they hadn't noticed him either. He stared at them via the safety of the reflection for a few seconds. It was more comforting than looking at his own face. The two were engaged in an animated conversation. From their dress, one might surmise that the conversation was gossip about office interactions. He turned his ear and listened passively. He could only comprehend every other word over the din of background noise, and the names mentioned were meaningless to him, but it made him feel slightly less alone to hear words, even words not directed towards him. He looked down at his shoes and waited for the bartender to notice him. His throat was dry. The music seemed to increase in volume and began to drown out any hope of comprehending any of the conversations around him. He was tired. His shoes were old and scuffed and covered with mud. The sound from the unseen speakers seemed to change from top 40 into the rhythm of a beating heart. Was that just the sound of blood rushing through his arteries? He closed his eyes. The thumping put him in a trance. He began to have a vision he'd had before. All of a sudden, he wasn't in a nondescript neighborhood bar, but was instead being lowered into a pit. The pit was smoky, and he could see the faint outline of a dragon or some serpentine being of similar dimensions and ferocity at the bottom, waiting for him. He was inexorably falling, but interminably slow, as if he were tumbling downwards through a jar of lugubrious honey. The creature below was only half aware of his presence. "What'll it be?" said the bartender. The protagonist looked up. "What are you drinking?" the man repeated with almost imperceptible annoyance. Disoriented, thankful to have been plucked out of the pit and returned to his seat, all he really desired was water. He ordered a glass of bourbon. The bartender chose not to ask his preferred brand and wordlessly served him a short, thick glass with an inch of brownish liquid at the bottom. The protagonist leaned down and breathed the acrid, burning scent into his sinuses. The sharpness began to bring him back into focus. He looked up to ask for some water, but the bartender had already moved elsewhere. Still hunched over his glass, his eye caught the two women sitting to his left. They were staring at him. "Are you okay?" said one. "Okay?" He repeated the question. "I suppose you mean in the specific sense, as in, am I sick to my stomach or feeling lightheaded? And not in the broader, more philosophical sense. The answers to those two questions are quite different." He cleared his throat, straightened his posture, and let out a sigh. "But, for the present, I guess I am okay." He half smiled. "Just tired," he added after an uncomfortable pause. The women went back to their conversation. The protagonist excused himself and went to the bathroom, leaving his drink at the bar. "So anyway, I'm writing a novel," said Simone. "You're writing a novel?" replied Hannah, with a slight tone of surprise in her voice. "Well, I'm just starting. I've never tried before. I guess I've been looking to take on a new project to help me find meaning and fulfillment in my life." "Ugh, I wish I had the freedom to do that, but my family takes up so much of my time." "Okay, I'll bite. What's your novel about?" "I'm not sure yet. I'm using tone as a starting point instead of plot, so it's hard to say where it will take me. I'm letting the characters guide me where they want to go, but I'm already worried about one thing." "What's that?" "Well, have you heard the theory about how almost no modern works of fiction have a scene in which two named female characters talk to each other about something other than a man?" said Simone. "Is that true?" replied Hannah. "I heard it's true. I guess so. I mean, I don't pay close attention to every single movie and book out there, but I can believe it. I want to make sure my novel passes that test." "Okay, well then do it." "Yeah, you see, that's the problem. The book is told from the first person, and the main character is a guy, so there's no way to have a scene that he's not in. I mean, not without seeming a little out of place and awkward." "Just have him go to the bathroom or something and have some ladies at the next table chit-chat till he gets back." "Talk about what, though? Wouldn't be related to the plot." "Does it have to forward the plot? I thought you were just looking to satisfy some arbitrary standard you'd set for yourself." "It seems like it would be pretty obvious that I'm doing it just to pass some arbitrary standard unless it dovetails with and advances the rest of the story." "Right. That's what makes it meta. It's okay to do anything in a novel these days as long as you tip off the reader that you're self-aware to what you're doing." "Well, when do I put the scene in?" "Right in the beginning. Make it obvious from the start that your entire novel is self-aware of its inherent fictionality." Said Simone. At that moment, the protagonist returned from the bathroom. The two women continued their dialogue undisturbed, barely registering his return. He silently listened in to a melange of conversations from several nearby tables. At regular intervals, anonymous people left the bar, only to be replaced by equally anonymous people entering. Time elapsed slowly. The bartender poured several more drinks, and the protagonist was even able to eventually get his glass of water. Every few minutes he could hear the clattered release of pool balls, signifying that someone had won, someone had lost, and a new game had started. Throughout this time, he didn't interact with any of the patrons or do anything at all in particular. He remained quiet, even as his own thoughts. He let reality flow around him and through him with the tranquil awareness of Vipassana. It was a pleasant respite for him to not dwell on his own thoughts for a while. He was lonely, but it wasn't a loneliness that could be solved with the pleasant yet innocuous banter found in a bar. It wasn't a loneliness that could be solved at all, really. But, for now at least, he could temporarily hold back the dread of his continued existence by consciously choosing not to dwell on it. He closed his eyes and again breathed in the acrid fumes of alcohol emanating from his glass. When he opened his eyes, he noticed through the mirror that one of the women sitting next to him was leaving. She put on her coat and headed to the door. She did not acknowledge his presence as she left, and the protagonist chose not to speculate on her intended destination. He instead completely forgot her existence as soon as the door closed behind her, as if he were unaccustomed to object permanence. The woman who remained continued to nurse her drink quietly. He watched her through her reflection. Her posture was graceful, her dress stylish, but her face looked incurably sad and alone. She turned her head and caught his eye in the mirror. "Did I overhear that you were writing a book?" he said to her reactively. "Yes," she replied. "I did brag about that, but honestly, it was mostly just trying to impress someone. I don't have much more than a vague outline and some ideas for a few sentences of snappy dialogue." "Well, I've always felt that the key to being happy is just to keep yourself busy with unimportant nonsense, and eventually you'll be dead. Writing books seems like a good project in that regard, even if it goes nowhere and you're just doing it to impress people you don't even care about. You should be commended, encouraged to continue." "You don't think writing is a waste of time? I suspect you must also be a writer, then." "No, no. Although I do sometimes wonder if I'm a fictional character in someone else's novel." He rubbed his eyes with his hand. "Maybe I'm a character in your novel, in which case it is vitally important that you finish this chapter. Otherwise I'll be stuck in this shabby neighborhood pub for eternity waiting for my next line." "Well, I certainly couldn't subject you to a fate like that," she replied, with a chuckle. She introduced herself to him. They shook hands. They continued the conversation. They had several more drinks. They flirted awkwardly and pitiably, but mostly apathetically, as it was apparent they were more attracted to the idea of simply not being alone than in any particular attribute of the other person. But it was what it was, and they were both grateful for the attention, even if it was just unimportant nonsense. Her eyes were half closed by the time she whispered, "Do you want to get out of here?" He did. The protagonist donned his now dry overcoat and helped her with her jacket. As they reached the street, she gestured, "My apartment is this way." They walked, mostly in silence. In the bar, their conversation had been muffled to the point of anonymity by the presence of other noises. But here, on the empty and dimly lit street, their inconsequential words would carry. Further awkward flirtation would seem embarrassing now that it might be overheard. He wondered if it might snow tonight. The air was beginning to acquire a crispness to it that he had to reach back into last winter's memory to recollect feeling. The pair walked several blocks through the streets, under street lights and traffic lights, and crisscrossed overhead wires that pulsed with unknowable electrical signals being transmitted to and fro. They reached the part of the city where buildings were more than just squat and flat-roofed bars and small unlit houses. Apartments and offices rose overhead like stirring giants. They were not particularly high, just 5 or 6 stories at the most, but old, almost impossibly old, and covered with patches of the thick black soot that betrayed their advanced age. Several still had lights burning in a few of their windows. The pair continued down the street until a body suddenly fell from the sky, landing with a wet thud on the pavement, not 15 feet in front of them. The protagonist observed the crumpled corpse before them with little more than a sigh. A slow trickle of blood began to leak and wind its way past some litter into the gutter. He mumbled, not having anything better to say. "You should be more careful when they do that. Could have landed right on us." He looked up to see if there was any sign of where the person came from, but all seemed quiet and still on the balconies above. "This is the third one I've seen just today," the woman remarked flatly. "It's been happening more and more. Everything just gets worse," he replied. The two stood around for a moment, wondering if they should do something, but then a doorman came out of the building's entrance, walked over to the body, and waved them off. The protagonist and the woman gingerly stepped around the scene in the puddle of blood and left the doorman to his grim task as he returned to the building to retrieve a mop. The woman's residence was only a block further on. She fumbled with her keys for a second and slid open the half-rusted gate that guarded the main entrance. Inside, the hallway was dark, but as the door closed behind them, some overhead fluorescent bulbs sputtered to life with an almost imperceptible hum. The lobby floor was a checkerboard of white and black tiles, several cracked. The once white walls were yellowed with age. fixtures were in an Art Deco style that in the distant past was probably considered quite stylish and fashionable. "The elevator doesn't work," she said. "It hasn't worked for a long time now." She followed up with, "The super said that an heirloom made off with some irreplaceable part. I don't know." But she noted that she was only on the third floor. The stairwell echoed loudly as they made their way upstairs. The protagonist observed that the marble steps all had deep indentations from repeated use. He wondered how many thousands of people over how many decades would have needed to traverse each landing to wear them away to that extent. He couldn't guess at an answer. The pair then traveled through a long hallway filled with identical doors that led to presumably identical apartments. The protagonist heard muffled noises that might have been screams coming from behind one door, but he couldn't be sure. It might just have been a radio. She held the key ready in her hand by the time they reached the door. It swung open to reveal a cluttered yet welcoming apartment. There was a faint smell of incense or perfume still in the air. A dimmed lamp bathed the room in colored light. Dropping her purse by the door, she guided him to the couch and asked if he wanted a drink. He said yes, reflexively, without giving the question consideration. In the kitchen, she fumbled with the task of getting a cork out of a bottle. "Do you do this often?" he called to her. "This?" she replied, pouring some wine. "Invite people to your apartment late at night." "Does it matter?" she said, sitting next to him and handing him a glass. "No, I suppose it doesn't." He noticed that the glass wasn't a glass at all, but was a small canning jar, complete with threads at the rim for a lid. The wine was warm and sweeter than he preferred. He took a small sip and placed the jar on the table next to the sofa. She cuddled up next to him and threw her legs into his lap. They avoided each other's gaze for a moment, and when their eyes met, he attempted a smile. She kissed him. Pulling away, she said drunkenly, "You smile like you're sad." "Do I?" "It's sort of cute," she replied. She leaned in and kissed him on his cheek. He could feel the heat of her breath against his neck. He could smell the scent of her hair. He put his arm around her. "That's nice," she whispered sleepily and nuzzled her forehead into his collar. "Aren't you glad you're not fictional?" she mumbled, making reference to his earlier comment from when they first met. "I know you took it as a joke, and I guess I probably meant it that way, but I wasn't completely kidding about that. I'm really unsure what's real anymore." She chose not to reply. He sipped his too sweet wine and sighed. He continued, "It's like, take us right now sitting on this couch. This looks real, right? This looks material, factual, tangible. You can touch it. We can touch each other." She put her hand on his forearm. "But this is only an instant. It's just now. There's nothing about us being here at this time that really informs us where we were before, or who we were before. I think I remember where I grew up, what school I went to, how I ended up on that street in front of the pub tonight, but am I right? And does it even matter? It's that everything that's ever happened before this instant is so intangible that it's impossible to actually say what's true and what's just our self-delusions." She lurched forward so as to be on top of him and kissed him sloppily to shut him up. They fell into it, like a daydream or a fever. Lips and tongues entwined for a few moments as he fumbled with her sweater and she grinded her body against his as she held him down. Twice they had to stop momentarily because her long hair had gotten entangled in his mouth, but they quickly came back together. With his hands around her waist, he could feel her chest expanding and contracting with each breath. He could feel her aliveness, and she had chosen him. Maybe not for any good reason, maybe only for this single evening, but she had chosen him, and for a second, he felt less alone. "Hold on," she said suddenly. "I have to pee. I'll be right back." She jumped off of him and disappeared behind a door, stumbling slightly as she went. And if there's no difference between what's factually happened and what's just fiction, then is it even possible to prove I'm an actual physical person and not just a fictional construct, he mumbled under his breath after she left. The couch had a dark green velvet cover that was soft but slightly stained and somewhat disheveled. There were also several throw pillows, which by now had been knocked to the floor. He picked them up and placed them back where they had started. He waited patiently for her return, sipping his cloying wine slowly. For a moment he wondered if the woman was real at all or just someone he'd made up in his head out of desperation. But he rejected this thought, as his presence in this apartment wouldn't make sense if she was just a delusion, would it? She'd only been gone a minute, but he already missed the smell of her skin and the weight of her body on his. Restless, he stood up and paced about the small apartment, aimlessly exploring. There was a window that looked out onto the street below. The lights betrayed the presence of a fine mist in the air that might have been rain, or perhaps just a dense fog. Under the window was a radiator, covered with a thick layer of paint that cracked and peeled in places, exposing several previous colors underneath. The furnishings were shoddy but functional. End tables covered with knickknacks, a pile of mismatched plates drying by the sink. Several photographs of people the protagonist would never meet were affixed to the refrigerator door. An unremarkable painting that was perhaps given to her by an artist friend. 2 vintage movie posters, a small mirror in a cheap, intricate frame. The floor was wood, faded and discolored in places, with a large shag carpet covering most of it. He perused the titles of the books she kept on a shelf to judge her tastes, and was surprised at the number he recognized, although had never gotten around to reading. He did the same with the records she had stacked next to the player. Her tastes here were clearly different than his, but he did come across one particularly obscure record that he had only ever seen once before, when a previous lover attempted to convince him of its merit. Strange to see it here as well. As he looked around, he came to realize he wasn't in a particular apartment owned by a particular girl named Simone, but he was instead in an amalgamation of all the apartments owned by all the women he had ever been intimate with, all the women who he had ever known, possibly even all the women he ever would know. On a desk, he recognized a flute that he was positive was the one played by a girl he dated who was in the school's marching band. He recognized a pile of plums in a distinctively chipped bowl that looked and smelled as delicious as the ones once picked from the backyard of someone he was serious about many years ago when he lived in a warmer climate. He noticed that there was now music playing, sounds of classic jazz that he first experienced late at night in the apartment of someone who turned out to be just a friend, despite his best efforts. Above his head were small white Christmas lights strung in the corners of the ceiling. Did he once help someone put those up? I only ask because you're so much taller than me, he remembered hearing in a whisper. She still hadn't returned from the bathroom. He inspected several plants on the windowsill, half dead from dehydration. He couldn't let them die again. He rinsed the dregs of wine out of his glass and filled it with water. The thirsty plants were grateful for the reprieve, but the protagonist was sure that he was only delaying the inevitable. He poured himself a little more of the wine and sat back on the velvet couch. He lifted a purple crystal off the table and felt its weight in his hand. Had he held this particular stone before? Or did an almost identical stone exist in all the apartments in all the world? It seemed so similar. He was pretty sure he'd never had a serious romantic partner. He'd had flings, of course, and one-night stands, and at least one ill-advised whirlwind affair. He was pretty sure of those. He had at numerous times spent months pining away for someone who would never return his affection, or spent months pushing away someone trying to get close to him because he knew he'd only end up hurting them in the end. He had even shared what he called love with a partner once, only to later realize he was unsure of what that term really meant. But he couldn't remember ever experiencing a soulmate, a person who understood him, whom he understood. He didn't even know if it was possible to really understand someone. The tragedy of existence is that everyone in the world only gets to experience reality from their one single point of view. Sure, you could assume that other people thought like you and perceived the world like you, but There was no way to know that for certain. Is what I call blue also blue to you? Or do you see something totally different? He thought. Is what I call love also love to you? Or do you feel something totally different? Eventually, tired of waiting, he went over to the closed door and peeked inside. The lights were on. The woman lay on her bed, half sideways, eyes closed, fast asleep. Her mouth was open and she was snoring daintily. He understood. It was late. He could go to her, climb into her bed and cover himself with her sheets and fall asleep in her arms. He did consider it. For the low cost of an awkward goodbye in the morning, he could revel in an entire evening of not being alone, of feeling skin on skin. But that would be the extent of it, wouldn't it? Skin on skin. Not heart on heart, not soul on soul, not love, not even lust. Just a self-delusion shared by two people aching to fill a void that could never be filled authentically. He closed the door gently. He turned off the stereo and again washed out his glass in the sink, and washed out her glass as well, quietly putting them both on the rack to dry. He put on his shoes and coat. For a second, he wondered if he should at least leave a note saying that he had a good time and offering his phone number if she ever wanted to do it again. But he realized that was pointless. He knew little about her life, and she knew even less about his. Nothing that had been said between them tonight hinted at the possibility of any deeper connection. She was sweet and pretty, and he was courteous and handsome. But there are millions of people in the world who are sweet and pretty and courteous and handsome. She would certainly not call. There was a decent chance she might not remember meeting him at all, her night being just a blur of strong cocktails and vague recollections of indistinct faces. He turned off the lights in the living room and let himself out, closing the door softly and carefully so as not to wake anyone at this late hour.